So, what's really going on in the world right now? I'm sure you've noticed, but things are not going well. We've seen political assassinations, political violence. We've seen the chronic disease epidemic, people dying at a young age, chronic disease affecting children. We've seen terrorist attacks. We've seen the corruption of our medical system, our corruption of our education system, corruption of our governments turning against us. So things are generally speaking going bad, especially in Western civilization, but it's spreading to other countries as well. This video is meant to explain in detail why things are going bad, why things are going wrong. I'm sure you can feel it. Many people are in despair right now, but I want to try to explain why. And even if we can't fight back, we can try to fight back, but at least it's comforting to know why this is happening. And I want to ask people listening to basically keep an open mind. You may come into this with some preconceived notions about what might be happening. And I want to ask you to keep an open mind because this video is actually going to debunk some preconceived notions that people have about what's really going on. So please keep an open mind and keep your thinking caps on because basically I'm going to ask you to think deeply and think logically about what's going on because we're basically in sort of the matrix and you have to be Neo of the matrix and kind of see through the matrix to really understand what's going on. And it's going to require some thought just like how, of complex phenomenon. So just like how trying to understand evolution is hard, and I won't get into the human evolution, but if you just think of like how did dogs come from wolves, right? That's sort of weird because you see this end product of like a chihuahua, and how is that related to a gray wolf? They look so different, right? But what you need to understand is that evolution is a gradual process that happens over multiple generations. And in this case, it's man-made because man, sort of basically applied evolutionary pressure for dogs to evolve in this way from wolves. But in the same sense, what I'm going to talk about today is a phenomenon called unrestricted warfare. And unrestricted warfare is a slow and gradual process that happens over many decades. And the final end product is such that today's society looks nothing like society 100 years ago or 200 years ago. And in fact, things are much worse, right? We have all these strange things happening now, but that's a cumulative effect. And you have to understand that someone has had a plan to enact this warfare against us. And that happened over many decades. And so I'm just going to ask you to try to think carefully and think about, okay, what could have happened over the past 100 years that gradually built up such that today's society, people are celebrating, killing their own babies with abortion, and people are, injecting poison vaccines into kids, and there's all this brainwashing, etc. So it's a gradual phenomenon that happens over many years. Okay, and I'm also going to talk about some prominent conspiracy theories that are actually false. And I'm going to start first with the conspiracy theory that the Jewish people, the people of Israel, are somehow conspiring against the rest of us to take over the world and conquer everyone, right? So that's actually the most false theory. The second theory is that the deep state and the CIA, basically like the US government, is somehow conspiring against everybody, to take over the world. That's also false. And then number three is that the Muslim people, so the Islamic world, is somehow conspiring against the world to take it over. So that's, believe it or not, also false too. And then finally, number four is the global elite. So basically like the Davos people, the World Economic Forum, Bill Gates, and Klaus Schwab, Justin Trudeau, that those people are conspiring to take it over the world. And believe it or not, that's actually false as well. And the reason why all of those are false is because the true conspirator, the true mastermind behind the world takeover is the Chinese Communist Party. And it's the CCP, it's the Chinese government. And the way you can understand this very simply, just a really simple observation, is notice that everything in the world is toxic. All the toys that kids use nowadays are made of plastic instead of, they used to be made of wood. And who makes all of the and all the goods in the world? Well, it's all says made in China, right? This is a very simple observation, but it's a powerful one because you can see it every time you go buy something at the store. You see the word made in China, right? And so that implies two things. Number one, it implies that China has immense power, right? They control manufacturing in the world. And number two, when you realize that everything is toxic, you realize that, oh, China has actually been putting toxins into the goods that they manufacture, and that's not an accident. So that's very simple observation. Just gives you a hint that, oh, maybe China could be behind some of this. And of course, we can delve deeper. There's also the fact that fentanyl is known to be made in China, and fentanyl is one of the biggest killers of all Americans out of everything else. It kills like 200,000 Americans a year, and that comes directly from China. And then, of course, we know the Wuhan pandemic came from China, and that was a big disaster as well. So we have all of these kind of like dots, and we can connect the dots, and I'll connect the dots later. But the big message is that the CCP is the mastermind behind the conspiracy against humanity. Now, let's get to the false conspiracy theories. So I said number one, which is the most false, is that the Jewish people are conspiring against the world. The reason why that's the most false theory is because they are the key victims of the conspiracy. Remember that the Jewish people were the most vaccinated people in the world during the coronavirus pandemic, and we know the vaccines were harmful, right? And so they were the target, actually, of the vaccines. And then similarly, we had the 10/7 terrorist attack on Israel, and we also had the recent Australia attack on the Jewish people as well. So we've had these, major terrorist attacks, and on top of all of that, there's all this anti-Semitic propaganda out there. Try going on TikTok or YouTube without seeing anti-Jew propaganda. It's really hard to do. And so the Jewish people are actually the primary victims of the conspiracy. And there's a reason for that. That's because the Jewish people are the highest IQ people in the world, and it's very hard to control high IQ people. They're smart. They can sort of see through the issues, see through the facade, right? And they're really hard to control. They're also very successful, right? And so the CCP views the Jewish people as the main threat to their power, and that's why the Jewish people are a key target of the CCP's wrath, basically. So that's like the most false theory that you can have, actually, which is that the Jews are behind things. Now, the second theory, which is that the deep state or the CIA, the US government, is behind things, that's also false too. And note that the CCP also hates America, right? So they also want to blame everything on the USA. But the reason why there's some merit of truth to that deep state conspiracy theory is because the CCP has tried very hard to corrupt the U.S. government. They have basically tried, really hard to bribe and blackmail U.S. government officials to work against us, and that's why sometimes it feels like the U.S. government is working against the American people. We saw, for example, during the Biden administration that the FBI turned against the American people. They were sort of targeting Americans, right? Similarly, we saw during the pandemic that the other three-letter agencies, the CDC and the FDA, they were turning against the American people too. Okay, so that's why there's some merit of truth to the deep state theory, because the CCP has corrupted our institutions, right? It is possible to corrupt the FBI, the CDC, and even even the CIA potentially, right? So it is possible that the CCP can basically infiltrate effectively these institutions, either through bribes or blackmail, or by just literally putting people into those institutions. So that's worth noting. But the reason why, like I said, that it's false is that they're not the masterminds. Like, they may be sort of the puppets, like they're potentially being controlled, but they're not the masterminds behind the conspiracy. The CCP are the masterminds. And then furthermore, the CIA is actually one of our greatest allies in this fight. The CIA actually understands the principles of unrestricted warfare. They understand the idea of secret, surreptitious warfare. And so they actually know some of the tactics, the psyops that the CCP uses. And so the CIA is actually a great ally for the American people to help us fight back against the CCP. Okay, so that theory is false. And then the third theory was that the Muslims or the Islamic world is trying to take over the world. And that's actually false. But the reason why there's some small merit of truth to this is because there has been an alliance formed between radical Islamists and the CCP. And you might say, well, why would the CCP want to work with the Muslims? That doesn't make sense. Well, the CCP unfortunately doesn't view people as people. They view people as potential weapons, right? And so they view Muslims as potential weapons that they can use against the Jewish people and against the American people and against the European countries. And so basically, the CCP uses Muslims as kind of like a scapegoat to say like, oh, look at how these Muslims are causing so much trouble, right? So the CCP really uses them as a scapegoat for the anger that the West and the Jews have. And it's been documented that the CCP has ties to Al Qaeda, to Hezbollah, to Hamas, to ISIS. And I actually, believe it or not, this goes deep. I mean, this goes back to the 10/7 terrorist attack as well as the 9/11 terrorist attack. Both of those terrorist attacks very likely, and this is going to shock people, but very likely were masterminded by the CCP and carried out by the Muslim people, but nevertheless masterminded by the CCP. And I have seen pictures online of Osama bin Laden being trained by Chinese generals prior to 9/11. And my source, if you're interested in my source, because I didn't come up with this myself, there is a group of Chinese dissidents called the New Federal State of China, the NFSC. You can follow them on Twitter, on X, basically. Just follow their profile. And they were the ones who posted this picture of Osama bin Laden being trained by Chinese generals. There's a woman there named Ava Chen, and she was the one who posted this picture. And she and the NFSC more generally are trying to take down the CCP. They want to fight back against the CCP, and they were the ones who actually first came up with this theory that the CCP is responsible for all world disasters and all world tragedies. That agrees with my theory. I came up with this theory independently, but the NFSC also came up with this theory. And they were the ones who actually are providing the concrete evidence for this theory. They show that the CCP is behind a lot of these terrorist attacks, a lot of these pandemics, tragedies, the fentanyl stuff and everything. So please do follow the NFSC. That is my source. And so similarly, there's also a really good account on YouTube called China Uncensored. They also talk about unrestricted warfare. Follow China Uncensored on YouTube. That's my second source for the information in this video, okay? Those two accounts are the best two accounts that I've ever seen on explaining how the CCP is trying to take over the world and how they've caused all these disasters. Okay, so now let's get into, now that we've sort of debunked the false theories, let's get into the real theory. Like, what is the real theory? What's actually happening? And this is really deep and honestly kind of sad and depressing because all signs point to the fact that we have been at war with the CCP at least 100 years, ever since they were founded. So the CCP was founded in the 1920s. So ever since the CCP was founded, they've been at war with us. And we just didn't realize it. And, you know, every single interactions that we've had with the CCP has been basically an act of war of them against us. In their culture, the basically warfare is studied. Like they have this famous book that's called The Act of War that everyone, or the Art of War, and that everyone reads. And it's basically, you know, their ancestors passed down generations to generations about how do you wage war. Now, our ancestors in the West never taught us that. Like I was never raised on how do you actually wage war against other people. But, you know, they were taught that, and they learned tactics that we never learned. And that includes obviously tactics like, you know, bribing and blackmailing politicians, and you know, using other people as your weapons, kind of thing. And you know, I just want to be clear that in this video, I'm not blaming the Chinese people, and in fact, I want to make it clear that it's really the Chinese government not necessarily the Chinese people that are responsible for this conspiracy. And in fact, the Chinese people are largely victims of the CCP's aggression and horrible totalitarian things like one-child policy, forced abortions, and so the ultimate end goal of this video, as well as my YouTube channel, is I want people to be aware that the CCP is waging war on us, so that we can form alliances. I want there to be an alliance between the American people, the European people, the Chinese people, the Japanese people, the Korean people, the Southeast Asians, the Cambodians, the Thai people, right? And so the Indians, the Africans, right? And the Muslims. And I want all of us to recognize that we can ally together and fight back against the CCP, but only if we know that they're actually waging war against us. Like, you have to know your enemy. That's actually a principle in the art of war, which is that the only way to fight your enemy is to know your enemy. You have to first know who is your enemy, right? Right now, the U.S. is just lashing out in every direction, like, oh, maybe it's the Jews, maybe it's the CIA, maybe it's, Bill Gates, maybe it's, the Muslims, right? Like, people have no idea who they're actually fighting, right? You have to know your enemy. Once you know your enemy, then you can actually fight back. So in any case, over the past 100 years, at least, we have been fighting a secret war with the CCP. And this war goes way beyond like bombs and guns, right? In fact, the CCP typically doesn't even use bombs and guns, rarely, right? It's much more about propaganda, controlling our media, controlling our politicians, changing public policy in the West, right? Let's just take, for example, abortion, right? Abortion would have been, unheard of a long time ago, right? 100 years ago, right? Like, this was not something that was a normal thing to do. And now you have, just in the past 5 years, a major political party, the Democratic Party, actively celebrating killing their own babies. And that is something completely against human evolution, and it's something that requires decades of brainwashing. Like, you cannot have people murder their own babies unless you have brainwashed them for multiple decades. And I'm arguing that the CCP has done that by controlling our media, by controlling the education system. It's well known, for example, that the CCP has infiltrated universities through these Confucius Institutes, and they're operating on university campuses. And that also explains why university campuses turn out so many leftists, right? There is the whole phenomenon of leftism. What the heck is leftism? Well, leftism is basically a political ideology of being against your own people, being against your own race, being against your own heritage, being against your ancestors, being against your own country, being anti-patriotic, right? So leftism is exactly opposite to what evolutionary pressures would want. Like, evolution would want you to be in favor of yourself, right? Leftism is anti-self. It's against yourself, it's against your family, against your country. And so leftism is not a natural phenomenon. Leftism is created, it's engineered. And in fact, this has been highlighted by Yuri Bezmenov, who was a communist, basically a defector. He left the Soviet Union to warn America about how leftism was being engineered by the communists. Now this brings up an interesting point, which is that, like, he was talking about the Soviet communists. But how are the Soviet communists related to the CCP? Well, guess what? There was an alliance between the CCP and the Soviets. And in fact, it's very reasonable to suspect that the CCP actually installed the government into the Soviet Union. They basically took over the Russia, basically, and installed like a CCP-friendly government, right? Of course, Russia was on China's doorstep, right? They're like next door neighbors, and so the CCP is recognizing that, oh, I have this really powerful neighbor. Let me try to take them over. But that's a sort of aside, which is that the Soviet Union. All signs point to the fact that the Soviet Union, the government itself, was likely controlled by the CCP and installed by the CCP. And it was anti-West, anti-American, right? And that, of course, fits in with the CCP's goals. Um, and so, in any case, the Soviet Union worked together with the CCP to create leftism in America. And now we have leftists, right? What do we do with these people? We have Antifa, which also brings up the point, which is that we just had a major political assassination in America, which is Charlie Kirk's death. Charlie Kirk, there's been a lot of false conspiracy theories around the death of Charlie Kirk, but all like sort of practically thinking people sort of recognize that Antifa likely played a role. These are the far left activists in America. And how do we think of Antifa? Well, Antifa are basically a militia inside of America that is controlled by the CCP. They're basically the foot soldiers of the CCP, China's foot soldiers operating in America, inside our borders. These people are subject to very intense brainwashing by the CCP, and they get their orders directly by the CCP. And so now that we recognize that, we basically see that Charlie Kirk's assassination was almost certainly masterminded by the CCP. And those orders were given from the Chinese government to Antifa to carry out the attack, and then Antifa went ahead and carried it out. And that was like a major event in world history, his assassination. We can go back to other political assassinations. Think about Martin Luther King, right? Martin Luther King was keeping the peace between the black people and the white people, right? He was a peacemaker. He was kind of keeping us together. And the CCP doesn't like that because the CCP wants to see political violence and racial violence within our country. They want our country to fall apart, right? So it's very reasonable to assume that Martin Luther King was assassinated by the CCP, or at least masterminded. They always use other people to carry it out, right? So they mastermind it, and then they use another person to carry out the assassination. And so because everything aligns with the CCP motives, you have here a guy keeping the peace between the different races and keeping everyone happy, and then they took him out, and then sure enough, racial warfare sadly ensued after his death. So what about JFK? Well, and RFK. Well, the CCP thinks in terms of family dynasties, right? The CCP themselves is basically a family dynasty. It's a family that's controlling an entire country. It's a big family, right? They have a lot of people, of course, a lot of children. But in any case, they viewed the Kennedys as a threat to their dynasty because they saw the Kennedys as basically a family dynasty ruling over the United States, right? And so they're like, oh, shoot, here's this other family that has a dynasty over this other country. They're a big threat to us, so we have to take out that family dynasty. And that's why there's been so much violence against the Kennedys, right? It's not just JFK and it's not just RFK. There's been other Kennedys that have been sort of targeted, right? We've seen a lot of tragedies in the Kennedy family. So the Kennedys have been targeted by the CCP because they're viewed as a threat to the CCP's power. I mean, of course, on top of that, JFK himself was doing some other good things for America, like he was focusing on physical fitness, trying to get everyone in shape, trying to make sure that people didn't have chronic disease, and then also he was anti-war, right? So he was opposing sending all of our soldiers over to Vietnam to get slaughtered, right? And the CCP didn't want that because they wanted our soldiers to get slaughtered. So JFK was kind of standing in the way, protecting our military from death, right? And so they took out JFK, both because of this family dynasty issue, but also because JFK was doing some amazing things inside of America to help the American people. Around that time as well, we also had time of JFK, we also had the moon landing. And one of the famous recent conspiracy theories is that the U.S. never landed on the moon, right? So that's false, but it's really interesting why that's false. The reason is that China really views the moon as kind of sacred and like important part of their culture. And they want to lay claim to the moon. They don't like the fact that there's a U.S. flag that's planted on the moon right now. And they hate the fact that America has claimed some ownership to the moon. And they actually want to reclaim it for themselves And so they've planted this false conspiracy theory that the moon landing never happened, right? That the US government just kind of made this up, right? So this is an example of a false conspiracy theory, and you can really see the clear motivation behind it. China wants to lay claim to the moon, so they planted this theory basically to kind of discredit the fact that we have our flag up there. Okay, so with my remaining time, I just want to mention this broader issue of unrestricted warfare and how I won't be able to cover every aspect of it, but it also includes things like poison vaccines, poison food, poison water, and misinformation around health topics. My channel is largely about the carnivore diet, and I have talked a lot about conspiracies around diet and nutrition. The underlying driving force behind these. Now, I know that this is going to be confusing because many people think the underlying driving force behind those are big pharma, big food, and big agriculture, who definitely stand to make money off of this. But what makes even more sense is that, how is it possible that big pharma could be collaborating with big food and big agriculture and big medicine, and then all those four different industries are kind of working lockstep with one another? It's very hard to maintain such a collaboration. And what makes much more sense is if all of these industries are controlled top down by one source. So if the CCP has managed to somehow get control over each of these institutions, big pharma, big food, big agriculture, and big medicine, then they can just give kind of top-down orders, and then those four industries can kind of work in lockstep together. To get control of those companies, you don't have to control every single employee at the company. You just have to control the leadership of the company. You just have to control the CEOs, the people making the decisions, right? And so in that sense, you can control a company just by having blackmail on a CEO, right? Or just by bribing someone. So it doesn't take a lot to actually control a company. So that is my theory, which is that the CCP has corrupted our medical system and our food system in order to poison us, unfortunately. And this goes very deep. I won't cover it all in this video, but needless to say, it's been clear that there's been basically our medical system has been infiltrated by false information, misinformation. And, take, for example, the views on red meat, right? Red meat has been demonized, saturated fat, cholesterol, those have been demonized. And instead they promoted plants, and they promoted fruits and veggies and grains, right? So they promoted the foods that were most toxic to us, and they demonized the foods that were healthiest for us. The way to understand that is this is a particular form of unrestricted warfare. And then similarly, we can dive deeper into, the medical system and how nothing works in Western medicine. Like pharmaceuticals don't actually treat or cure anything. Surgeries don't work. Chemotherapy doesn't work to treat cancer. So our medical system is completely corrupted. It's a very bad situation that we're in right now. We live in a country where we cannot trust our institutions. We can't trust our medical system. We can't trust our food, right? It's very difficult. We're in a really dire situation. Just to sort of wrap up the video, I just want to say that as bad as you think the situation might be, it's like 100 times worse. Because every day that goes by, the CCP gains power and we lose power. Because it's a positive feedback loop. The more power they gain, the easier it is for them to gain more power, right? Because they can use the money that they make to bribe more people, right? And they're turning us against each other, right? There's a lot of infighting lately. I've seen in the American conservative movement, conservatives fighting other conservatives, right? I've seen, Muslim against Jew violence, and we've seen, all this sort of violence against other religions, right? The CCP are atheists, you think they care about religions? They don't care about religions at all. They just want to wipe out the religious people. So they love it whenever, one religion fights against another religion. That's their strategy. So just be aware that the situation is really bad. And we have to wake up now to have any hope of fighting back. And, I know that this may sound like a complicated theory, but it's actually a very simple theory. It's the most simple theory. There's a principle of Occam's razor. Occam's razor says the simplest theory is the most likely to be the correct theory. So all these other weird theories out there about the Jews and the Muslims and the CIA and the deep state and global elite, those are more complicated than my theory. My theory says it's just the people sitting in Beijing. It's just the CCP. They've been plotting against us for 100 years, and they're winning in a war that we didn't know that we were fighting in. We had no idea that we were fighting in this war, and we're losing badly. We're getting killed on every front. We're getting killed with fentanyl, with abortion, with birth control. We're getting killed with chronic disease, diabetes, heart disease, cancer, all these things, right? We're getting killed by a corrupt medical system that's working against us. I didn't even talk about our corrupt education system, which clearly the CCP has taken over our education system as well. So in any case, we're losing this war, and we're losing badly. So we have to recognize who we're fighting against, or else we face potential extinction. And I'm sorry to end on a bad note, but I just want people to recognize that this is very serious. Okay, have a wonderful day, and take care. All right, see you.